So what's a promise really worth? I mean, we make them all the time, but what happens when a legally binding promise gets broken and you just can't prove you lost money because of it? Well, today we're going to dig into a landmark case that completely rewrote the rule book on this, changing the game for everyone.
All right, so here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to start with the core problem itself. Then we'll dive into the real-life story of a business deal that went seriously wrong. We'll see how the Supreme Court had to step in, what new rules they came up with, and, the most important part, why any of this actually matters in the real world.
So, let's jump right in with the big puzzle at the heart of all this. In contract law, justice is usually pretty simple. It's about paying for any financial loss you caused. But what happens when you can't just put a number on the damage? When the old rules just don't seem to fit.
I want you to imagine this for a second. Someone breaks a promise they made to you, a legally binding one. You know they've gained something from breaking it, but you just can't prove exactly how much money you lost. So what happens? Do you get nothing? Do they just get away with it? That's the huge question we're tackling today.
And this is where a really fascinating legal idea called negotiating damages enters the picture. Basically, the court stops trying to calculate your specific loss and instead asks a pretty clever question. What would have been a fair price for you to just let them out of the promise in the first place?
Okay, here's the simple way to think about it. Imagine you own a private road. Someone starts using it as a shortcut, day in and day out, without asking you. Now, you haven't really lost any money, right? The road isn't damaged. But they've taken something valuable, the use of your property. Negotiating damages would be like figuring out the fee you would have charged them for permission to use that road. Simple as that. Now let's see how this idea played out in a real multi-million-pound deal.
All right, let's get into the real-world story here. Because this isn't just theory. It's about a massive business deal that went completely sideways.
So here's the rundown. Back in 2006, the founders of a company called One Step sold it for a ton of money. A key part of that deal was a promise. They agreed not to start a competing business for at least 3 years. But, yeah, you guessed it, they did exactly that. The new owners sued, of course, but they immediately hit a wall. I mean, how could they possibly prove the exact amount of profit they might have lost? It was nearly impossible. So they tried a different angle. They asked for negotiating damages instead. And this is where the whole story comes to a head. The case makes its way all the way up to the UK's Supreme Court. The judges took one look at the existing law on this and basically saw a complete mess. It was confusing, it was inconsistent, and they decided it was time to bring some serious clarity, once and for all. The court had to nail down one critical question. When exactly is it okay to use this hypothetical fee idea instead of the traditional approach of calculating financial loss? The legal world was desperate for a clear, predictable rule. And you can really see the massive change here. Before this case, the courts would just say that negotiating damages were available in exceptional cases or when it seemed just. But what does that even mean, right? It was totally unpredictable. The Supreme Court just swept all that away and came up with a new, much clearer test. They said, look, it's not about how hard it is to calculate your loss. It's about what you lost. Was it just potential profit, or was it something more, a valuable asset?
Okay, so let's actually break down that new test. The Supreme Court laid out a really logical framework for all future cases to follow.
So here's the new playbook, basically a 3-step test. First, the court looks at the asset. Was the promise that was broken designed to protect something valuable, like a piece of land, a patent, or confidential information? Second, they look at the purpose of that promise. Was the main goal just to make sure a certain profit was made, or was it really about protecting the right to control that asset? And finally, if the case is truly about protecting a right over an asset, then, and only then, do negotiating damages become a real option.
So here's the bottom line. The court made it crystal clear that negotiating damages are not just a free-for-all, not some easy alternative for when you can't be bothered to do the math on your lost profits. No, they are a specific tool for a specific kind of loss, the loss of control over something you own. That's a huge shift in thinking.
So why does an obscure legal case like this actually matter to the rest of us? Well, because it fundamentally changed the rules of the game for pretty much anyone who signs a contract.
So let's boil it all down. What should we take away from this? First, the court drew a very clear line in the sand. Protecting a specific asset, like a trade secret, is now treated differently than a simple promise about making a profit. Second, you can no longer use negotiating damages as an easy out just because calculating your loss is hard. You have to prove a specific right was violated, and that means, and this is a big one,
that clarity in your contracts is more important than ever. Vague wording just won't cut it anymore. Ultimately, this all leads to the price of breaking a promise becoming a whole lot more predictable for everybody.
And as you might guess, the business and legal worlds pretty much breathed a sigh of relief. This decision replaced a vague, confusing rule with a clear, logical test. And in the world of business and contracts, clarity and certainty, well, they're everything.
And that leaves us with a really interesting final question to think about. By making the rules clearer, did the court make promises more secure because now everyone knows the consequences? Or did it actually make them less secure by taking away a flexible tool for people who genuinely can't prove a financial loss? It's a puzzle that really shows you just how tricky valuing a promise can be. Thanks for joining this Explain.